Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the Minoans, hippies of the Bronze Age. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to talk about what's going on in the ancient Aegean at the same time that the pyramids are being built in Egypt and the ziggurats are being built in the Near East. And we'll see what's happening when we move to the world of ancient Greece. Now, what I'd like you guys to get out of today, I want you to be able to reconstruct the history that we're talking about, contextualize that more broadly, interpret archaeological and historical sources that we have for this group, and do that as we start out by talking about where we are geographically, moving into what's going on in the earliest days of the Bronze Age in the Aegean, from there talking about the Minoan material culture on the island of Crete, and then finally moving out from Crete to the broader Mediterranean to see how the Minoans, this kind of seafaring culture, start colonizing more broadly. Now, let's go ahead and think about what's going on at the height of the Bronze Age in these other places, right? So in Egypt, during the Bronze Age, we've already had the pyramids. We have these kind of spectacular temples at Luxor and Karnak. We have these kind of warfaring pharaohs moving all the way up into the Levant. And they're battling groups like the Hittites up here in Turkey, and eventually groups like the Assyrians over here in the Near East. And so over there in Egypt and the Near East, we're really getting the peak of Bronze Age culture. But when we move kind of further west into Turkey and into Greece, we start to hit what's called the Aegean, all right? So the Aegean Sea is this area in between modern-day Greece and modern-day Turkey. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that this starts out as kind of a backwater, and we're going to see what's going on at the same time of the pyramids in just a second. But even though later in history, right, in classical Greece and in the Roman Empire, this is close to the center of it all, early on in the Bronze Age, it's really quite a bit away from kind of the main centers over in Egypt and the Near East. Now, the Aegean Sea, right? Let's start with where that name comes from. And it comes from King Aegeus of Greece, all right? King Aegeus of Athens. And King Aegeus has a son, Theseus, and you all know Theseus is the guy who slays the Minotaur, all right? Now, what you may not know is that on his way back, Theseus makes a huge mistake. His dad was really worried about him, and so he said, all right, if you're alive when you're coming home, go ahead and take the sails from your ship and go ahead and change them to white, all right? So that I know that you're alive, so that as I see these ships sailing in, I know I can kind of relax a little bit. And what he does on his trip back is he just forgets to do this. So his ship's sails were black. As he sails up into the port of Athens, King Aegeus, his dad, sees this and is so distraught by what he thinks is his son's death that he throws himself off the cliff into the sea and therefore killing himself, but also giving the name the Aegean Sea. All right, so again, when we talk about the Aegean, what we're talking about is the sea over here in between modern-day Turkey and modern-day Greece, dotted with islands throughout. And over the next couple lectures, what we're going to talk about are the two major cultures of the Bronze Age Aegean, the Mycenaean culture centered on mainland Greece, and then the Minoan culture centered on the island of Crete. Now, one of the other things to remember is that when we're looking at all of this, right, we think about it now in terms of modern-day Turkey, modern-day Greece. We didn't have nation states like this in the ancient world, so we can kind of sort of think of this entire area, the whole area of Western modern Turkey and Greece and Crete, all as kind of Greece in the ancient world. Now, what's going on during the time of the pyramids, right? In the early Bronze Age, the 3rd millennium BC, in Egypt, right, we are getting the Great Pyramid built around 2500 BC, right? What's going on around the same time in Greece is something that looks in plan form like this. This is known as the House of Tiles at the site of Lerna, and it's kind of the biggest thing that we've got going on during the early Bronze Age. And as you can see, this is no pyramid here, right? This is not of the same scale and complexity as something like the pyramids of Giza. Over in the islands, we get these kind of cool sculptures in the Cycladic Islands. We call these Cycladic figurines. They're actually super popular today because they're cool kind of geometric abstractness. But when we take these kind of in total, right, these are not the kind of same level of complexity and labor needed to build something like the pyramids in Egypt. And that's why we kind of consider the Aegean as sort of a backwater early on, because we just don't have the same level of complexity. Now that starts to change in the second millennium BC. So from around 2000 to around 1000 BC, that's kind of where the Bronze Age in the Aegean really starts to flourish. And here you can see these frescoes from the Minoan culture on the island of Crete. And so think the kind of 1000s BC, the second millennium BC, as the time that we're really focused on for kind of the height of Bronze Age civilization in the Aegean. Now, I keep saying the word the Minoans, right? And you might be thinking, like, where does this come from, right? Why are we calling them the Minoans? You'll see later on that we call them the Mycenaeans because of the site of Mycenae, and that makes total sense, but we don't have a site of Minoa or anything like that. Rather, the Minoans comes from the myth of King Minos, all right? And to give you the kind of short version here, it all starts in classic mythology form, right? With Zeus turning himself into an animal so that he can go make out with a chick that he finds very attractive. And the person this is a woman by the name of Europa, who is a princess in Phoenicia, in Carthage. And so Zeus sees her and he's like, wow, she is beautiful. And so Zeus turns himself into this bright white bull, and he kind of wanders around her flock. And eventually she sees this beautiful bull and it's like, that is a gorgeous animal. So she sits on top of the bull, and as soon as that happens, Zeus flies off and starts swimming to the island of Crete. Now, when he gets there, they have a baby. Europa and Zeus have a baby, and they call him King Minos, all right? Now, one of the things that Minos was supposed to do is sacrifice his best bull every year to the god Poseidon, okay? And this is all well and good for a while, until one time where this year, the finest bull is so awesome that King Minos can't stand to part with it. And so he sacrifices his second best bull, thinking that, okay, well, maybe Poseidon won't notice. And of course Poseidon notices, right? And so what he does is he says, all right, Minos, right? If you like bulls, I'm gonna make your wife like bulls, right? In a weird kind of way. So he makes Minos' wife, Pasiphae, fall in love with this beautiful bull. And she gets so in love with this bull that she has their kind of palace architect, a man by the name of Daedalus, build her a bull costume. And she gets into this costume, and then 9 months later, they have a baby. The bull and the wife of Minos have a baby, and that, of course, is the monstrous Minotaur, which you can see over here, half man, half bull. Now, you can't just have a Minotaur running around a palace, and so they have that court architect Daedalus build a labyrinth beneath the palace in which to put the Minotaur. And at this time, Athens was indebted to Minos, and so they had to send 7 kids each year to the island of Crete, to the palace at Econosis, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to be kind of sacrificed, to be given to the Minotaur. And every time they'd be sent down into the labyrinth, and the Minotaur himself would kill them. And this all started to change when the king of Athens, Aegeus, has his son Theseus, and Theseus says, no longer. I will go to Econosis, I will go see the Minotaur, and I will slay the Minotaur. And so he goes down there, and with the help of Ariadne, right, the daughter of the king, he's able to get a ball of thread, wind his way into the center of the labyrinth, slay the Minotaur, and then get out of there. So after slaying the Minotaur, right, with his classic club there, he's able to escape using this ball of thread. Ariadne and Theseus run off to the island of Naxos. Things are looking really, really good. Then for some weird reason, Theseus is just like, all right, I'll see you later. And then he just leaves Ariadne. But then she marries Dionysus, so it like works out well for her in the end. Take my mythology class if you want to learn more about all these kind of crazy stories. But that's when Theseus goes back to Athens, right? Where he forgets to put the white sails up. He's got the black sails. His dad throws himself off the cliff, and we get the Aegean Sea to bring us back to where we started the lecture. Okay, but where is all this happening, right? King Minos, that's where we get our word, the Minoans, right? Rules from the palace at the site of Knossos, or Knossos, okay? So this is in the central upper portion of Crete. Now, what you're looking at here is kind of the reconstructed remains of this palace. And you can see some really weird things, right? These inverted, tapered columns, really bright colors. This was all reconstructed around 1900 by the excavator, Sir Arthur Evans. Now, you can see why the palace at Knossos is associated with the labyrinth. All you have to do is look at the complexity of the plan here to get a sense for kind of how labyrinthine the palace actually is. Now, as it turns out, right, this actually isn't a labyrinth. Instead, all these little things are storage areas. And that's actually super informative for what we can learn about the Minoans as a culture in terms of their kind of society and economics. And what this suggests to us as archaeologists is that with all these storehouses here as part of the palace, it suggests that what people are doing is they're farming and raising animals and things like that. And they're essentially shipping all of these to the palace, and then the palace then redistributes these amongst the people. And so this is what we call a redistributive economy. And we're again basing that on kind of the archaeological remains of palaces like this, as well as these kind of clay tablet texts that we get from the Greek mainland. All right, now when we look at the material culture associated with things like the palace at Knossos, one of the main things we see are the frescoes that kind of line the walls of the palace. And in these frescoes and in the pottery of the Minoans, we tend to see a lot of these kind of floral and faunal motifs, right? So here you see these kind of dolphins. Other places you'll end up seeing all kinds of flowers, other places monkeys, right? And this is part of the reason that we kind of picture the Minoans, the hippies of the Mediterranean, the hippies of the Bronze Age. It's all these kind of beautiful floral and faunal motifs associated with the fact that when you look at the palace, right, one of the weirdest things is that they don't have defensive walls. And if you look at any other city of the Bronze Age, right, they've all got massive defensive walls because the first thing your neighbor wants to do is go attack you, right? But the Minoans, no walls, beautiful kind of floral and faunal motifs. They were just hanging out, having a good time. We can see that here in the throne room at the palace. This is part of what gives us a sense for the fact that the Minoans were a monarchy, right? So you can see the throne here. You can see the kind of floral and faunal motifs, right, with this kind of mythical creature over here. And you can also start to get a sense for how much is actually recreated, right? So some of this back wall is actually original in terms of the painting. A lot of this is what Sir Arthur Evans did around 1900 when he restored the palace. And you can see that here as well. So what we're looking at is a fresco. And when I say the word fresco, okay, what I'm talking about is an actual method of painting in the ancient world, okay? And that method of painting is when you paint, right? You actually use the pigments on wet plaster, right? So the wall itself, the stucco wall itself is still wet when you paint. And so the pigment gets set into the wall itself. And that's why we still have these today, right? That's why it just doesn't wash off when it rains or something like that, because it's actually built into the wall. So here you can get a good sense for how much is actually restored. It's all these little bits right here that are original, and all the kind of lighter colored stuff, that's all restoration. But what you're looking at is something that's like intimately tied with Minoan culture, and that's this idea of bull leaping, okay? And so we've got this in huge fresco form here where we see some kind of young man jumping over the back of a charging bull, and then we see women on each side kind of running the ceremony or performance or whatever it is that we're looking at. And it's not just in frescoes that we see this. So we have little statuettes, we have seals, we have all kinds of things that show this bull leaping, and we can kind of think of it as a proto-sport, right? We don't know really whether it was a competitive sport or performance, but something that certainly takes a lot of athletic prowess to do. And that's not the only way the bulls show up, right? So you listened to the myth earlier, right? The bull is a huge part of the origins of kind of Minoan mythology, right? We see it in bull leaping. We also see it in a bunch of other places in Minoan material culture. So over here we see what we call the horns of consecration, all right? So the idea that they're these large architectural horns of a bull, and we think that sacrifices would have been performed there. We also see them portrayed on pottery, and then we also see them portrayed as pottery, right? These are known as rhytons right here. And a rhyton, you could pour a liquid into the back of these things, and then you pour it out of kind of the nostrils or the mouth or something along those lines. So the bull is a huge part of kind of Minoan culture and Minoan religion, and we can see that in a bunch of different material formats. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the Minoans is that this doesn't just occur on the island of Crete. If you go back to that map that we looked at earlier, you'll see that there are islands all across the Aegean, right? Hundreds and hundreds of islands. And what we see is that that's conducive to becoming a very seafaring culture, right? If you have that much coastline, if you have all these islands, right, you're going to get really good at sailing. And the Minoans end up doing that and starting to colonize a number of different islands within the Aegean. The most famous of which is what we now call the island of Santorini. So you've all kind of seen like pictures of something like this, these kind of cubist, white cubist houses in the Aegean with the blue domes, things like that. And the ones on the island of Santorini are some of the most famous. But in antiquity, this was known as the island of Thera. And so we can see Crete down here, we can see Santorini just up there, and the Minoans, sometime in the middle of the second millennium, set up shop on that island and established different colonies. And we can see that in the archaeological remains of the island itself. So we can see over here some of the remains of houses. We can see some of the frescoes and just how similar they are to what we get on the island of Crete. So the dates are similar, the art is similar, the architecture is similar, and that's what makes us think that it's people from the island of Crete who are going here to establish a new city, a new colony. Now, one of the coolest things about this, and maybe not cool for the people living there at the time, is that there's a huge eruption on the island of Thera, right, modern Santorini, sometime in the 16th century BC, right? So it used to be this kind of normal island, and then there's a massive, massive eruption, right? There's a long debate about when this actually occurred. We think now sometime in the 1500s BC. And with that eruption, we get half the island totally blown away. So this is what it would have looked like previously. This is what it looks like afterwards, right? The whole center of the island has been blown away, and what you end up getting is the caldera, okay? So just the kind of outside of the island, the rim of what the volcano used to be. Now, because we see this sinking of the island, right? And because it had this very advanced Minoan culture way, way back before, 1,000 years before classical Greece, some people have started to associate the island of Santorini, right, or the island of Thera, as the kind of mythical Atlantis, this place of highly civilized culture and society, eventually sinking to the bottom of the Aegean Sea. Now, it's actually Plato who writes about Atlantis, so about 1,000 years after the volcano actually erupts. And we tend not to think that it's probably not actually the case that he was thinking of this. It would have been way long ago. He's just doing a thought experiment here, but it's still a fun thing to kind of think about, where we do have this very highly civilized society. It does, on the island of Thera, blow up, You lose half of it under the sea at that point. So, some concluding thoughts here, okay? So when we're looking at the Aegean Bronze Age, right, we're moving west from Egypt and the Near East. Early on, it starts as kind of a backwater, right, where there's not much going on in the third millennium. But by the second millennium, we're getting pretty sophisticated palaces, right? The kind of labyrinthine palace at Econosis. We get the whole culture built out of the myth of King Minos, right, and the Minotaur. Bulls are a huge part of Minoan culture, and we see them starting to set sail beyond the kind of confines of the island of Crete to other islands in the Mediterranean where they're setting up shop. So, in a lot of ways, it's a similar thing that's going on to other parts of the Mediterranean and other parts of the Near East during the Bronze Age, right? We're getting increased complexity in terms of material culture. We're seeing that manifest itself in terms of monumental structures, right? Here, like the palace at Econosis. And then we see it kind of fall apart, right? Whether it's because of the volcano or the sea peoples of Egyptian history, right around kind of 1200, 1100 BC. So, thanks for paying attention today to today's lecture on the Minoans, hippies of the Mediterranean.